I specifically want to discuss part RR, which is the use of force policy for police officers. In the legislation, it actually states brandishes. Can you give me the definition of what that brandish is intended in the legislation?
It's not defined in statute. It has its plain meaning.
I'm sorry?
It is not defined in statute. It has its plain meaning.
Okay,
right?
so the plain meaning, according to Webster's, right, if you agree, please let me know, is to wave or flourish something as a threat or an anger or excitement. Would you think that would be the definition in this case?
You know, since this is a reporting statute, DCJS will determine, I would think, the guidance for law enforcement so that they could be uniform reporting throughout the state.
Another definition for brandish under the federal code is just having any part of a firearm show. Would you agree with that definition as well?
You know, I would just restate that the DCJS will develop the rules and regulations of what should be reported.
Okay, so the reason why I'm asking that is because every time a police officer shows up to a scene responding to a call, according to the definition of the federal government in their code, just the butt of the gun showing out of their holster would constitute brandishing, if you just take it that way. Do you agree with that?
You know, I would just repeat what I said, that since you know, it's going to be a reporting statute, so the agency will help determine that to provide the guidance for law enforcement officers around the state.
Fair enough. So, like I've spoken several times on other bills in the past, over the past few weeks, one thing I want to point out is I think when we write legislation or introduce legislation and we don't define the words we're using, the transition to the street is much different than what we intend here. So would you agree with that?
Perhaps, but you know, again, I'll just go, you know, back to it's a reporting statute, and there'll be guidance issued on that.
Okay. Are you familiar with the continuum of force in law enforcement?
I mean, I guess you're referring to the, you know, the principle of using the least force necessary in a situation.
Yes. So, if I may, can I explain a little bit about it?
Please
and with a question as a follow-up. Continuum of force is just the mere presence in uniform by a police officer is the first level of force. Doing a vehicle stop can be continuum of force. If the situation rises to another level, you can do verbal commands, and then you could use the equipment that's provided to you as a police officer, whether that be a baton, a handcuff, your actual shield, a firearm. So would all those things constitute the reporting requirements in this legislation?
Clearly not, and I would think you would agree, and I go back to all of, in terms of detailed requirement of what needs to be reported, that DCJS will determine that. They will determine what needs to be reported with guidance for law enforcement.
Well, according to the legislation, there were some parts that were labeled here in the bill. So it's brandishing a firearm at or in the direction of another person, a taser, OC spray, otherwise known as pepper spray sometimes, using some electronic deployment which is a new technique in law enforcement, where we try and impact the person's hearing to make them stop doing what they're doing. Also, there's also in this bill, it says any specific use of a chokehold or similar restraint that applies pressure to the throat or windpipe of a person in a manner that may hinder breathing or reduce intake of air. Are there any other uses of force that DCJS may include in that, do you think?
Well, there also you left out the Section F, which engages in conduct results in the death or serious bodily injury of another person. So
yes.
That could be something that isn't otherwise delineated in the list above.
Okay. So one of my instructors in the academy many years ago when I went through told me that when we respond to a incident, a 911 call, remember, how many times is there a gun when a police officer responds? Do you know the answer to that?
No, I don't, but I certainly know that you don't know when you arrive at a scene necessarily.
Actually, at every incident a police officer responds to, there is a gun. Because that gun is the weapon of the police officer.
Right.
And at any time, it can actually become an instrument used by the perpetrator.
Right.
Are you aware of how many times firearms have been removed from police officers and used on them?
No, I do not. I did have the pleasure of visiting the new police academy in Queens, and we saw some demonstrations, of that.
Yeah. Did you get to use the FATS machine? You know what the FATS machine is?
I just watched.
All right. It's actually, simulation of what you would do and respond.
Right.
Yep.
So, some of the colleagues there did. No, it was it was an impressive visit.
Yeah. So getting back to brandishing the firearm, if we're doing a vehicle stop as a police officer, would you think it would have to be required if you're working a midnight tour and you and your partner pull over this vehicle with some occupants that may fit a robbery pattern, and you do not point your firearm at the vehicle or at the individual, but you have the firearm along your leg as you approach the car? The occupants don't see the firearm. Would the police officer be required under this legislation to give that and to provide that information as use of force?
I think I'm going to go back to what I was saying. DCJS is the main law enforcement agency in our state. They are going to be developing the reporting the reporting form, the guidance. So I think discussing individual types of situations I don't think will impact my answer. But I would just refer back to the fact that they do training, they develop policies, they know what is happening in the field, so the form they develop, the requirements for reporting, I think will fit in with training that officers and practice that officers in our state have.
Do we know how many departments throughout New York State already compiled this information of use of force and made it public?
Right. I couldn't tell you how many do. Some do. Clearly, in New York City, which covers a large part of our state's population, there is the requirement for reporting for when there's a stop and frisk situation. That's been happening, so it doesn't seem like it's an overly burdensome task to require.
Okay. Are there any requirements in the legislation to compile and document the use of force or assault committed by perpetrators on police officers?
Right. Not on this form. Presumably, those situations would be reported as a crime. If a police officer is assaulted.
Okay. Well, this legislation requires that on an annual basis for the prior year, that agencies give this information to DCGAS so they can put it on the website, right? And to give an exact date, location, and county where the incident occurred for the prior year. As I read correctly, it doesn't require names to be shared.
Correct.
But right?
Yes, correct.
But it can give the exact date and time and county where it occurred. And if we're doing that within a year, it's quite possible that the criminal sanctions or criminal process has not moved forward. Do you believe that this could actually impact criminal proceedings because we'll be giving information out publicly that is not yet presented in court?
I don't see how it would impact an existing case.
It actually states in the legislation that they have to give some background information of the occurrence, exactly how it happened. That may be prejudicial to both the perpetrator and potentially the police officer if there is a question about whether they were authorized to use that force.
Right. So the notion is not to look and focus in on one individual incident, but to use this collected annual data to look to see if there are patterns, if there are problems in particular areas, particular communities. So it's not to focus in on one individual incident.
I understand that, but are you aware that if they do put that information out into the public realm on a website, it would be subject to Rosario?
Well, there's no officer's name. It's just date and location.
Absolutely, I agree with you. I read the legislation. There are no names. There are no date of births. There are no pertinent information to the individual. But there is pertinent information to the type of occurrence, the location where it happened, and details of the incident. And therefore, don't you think that that may be able to identify if it is a public, let's just say it's a newsworthy case that's out there. So this could potentially impact criminal proceedings, don't you think?
I doubt that, and I'm sure as we have the discussion later on about discovery, the changes in discovery, that information I assume would already be out there. And as I said, that in New York City, the stop and frisk information, which is much more detailed than is required under this proposal, has already been happening, and there have not been incidents that I'm aware of because of that.
So, based on the information, and trust me, I know New York City has been doing this for years. They don't, when they put out their information, the NYPD, on their website, it is not from the previous year. It's generally a 2 to 3 year lag, right, when it gets publicized. Some of the things that we're speaking about today in this legislation has already been documented by the NYPD. I just want to share some data. I know if you think this is pertinent to what we're trying to do across the state. So in 2016, there were approximately 35,000 officers in the NYPD. There were 72 intentional firearm discharges by police officers. 72. There were 32 subjects shot, 9 fatally, 1 including a police officer who was killed by the perpetrator. Tasers had 501 discharges. OC spray, 227 deployments. 95 impact weapons, which are batons. So do we think that the numbers will be that much greater in the state?
Mr. Reilly, you have elapsed the first 15.
Thank you, Mr.
If you are interested, you may return.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.